The Humvee hit the ground with a sickening crunch, the force of the rocket-propelled grenade lifting it like a toy before slamming it back down into the dry Afghan riverbed. Inside the vehicle, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reyes felt the blast wave pass through his chest, the air suddenly thick with dust and the sharp, acrid smell of burned explosives. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, but beneath it, he could hear the distinct, horrifying sound of metal tearing and men screaming. This was it. The ambush they had all feared, the one every operator knew could be waiting around any corner in Paktika province, had just been sprung with terrifying precision. As the medic for this SEAL team, Marcus's training took over instantly, a calm, cold mechanism clicking into place above the primal fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. He shook his head to clear the cobwebs, his hands already patting down his own body, checking for wounds. Finding none, his focus snapped to the men around him. The vehicle's cabin was chaos. Smoke billowed in, stinging his eyes. Through the haze, he saw the driver, a young man named Kelly, slumped over the steering wheel, a jagged piece of shrapnel protruding from his shoulder. He was conscious, but his eyes were wide with a shock that Marcus knew could be just as deadly as the wound itself. "Kelly! Kelly, look at me!" Marcus shouted, his voice a harsh rasp that cut through the din. He reached forward, his fingers finding Kelly's neck, checking his pulse. Strong but thready, fast. He needed to move him, to get him out of this steel trap. Another RPG slammed into the canyon wall above them, showering the vehicle with rocks and debris. And this was a kill box. They were sitting ducks. Without a second thought, Marcus unbuckled his harness and pushed open the heavy door. The moment it cracked, the sound of the outside world flooded in. The deafening, overlapping cracks of AK-47s, the deeper thump of insurgent machine guns, and the desperate, controlled return fire from his teammates who had managed to exit the other vehicles. He dropped to the ground, the rocky floor scraping his knees through his uniform. The air was alive with lead. He could hear the snaps as rounds passed close to his head, each one a whispered promise of death. He scrambled around to the driver's side, using the Humvee's engine block as a fragile shield. Kelly was trapped, pinned by the steering wheel that had buckled in the blast. "I got you, man! I got you!" Marcus grunted, reaching in. He grabbed Kelly by his vest and pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. For a heart-stopping second, Kelly didn't move. Then, with a groan of pain from the young SEAL, he came free. Marcus dragged him backward, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose stones, pulling him behind the cover of the vehicle's rear tire. He laid Kelly down, his movements efficient and practiced. He ripped open Kelly's uniform to expose the wound, packed it with gauze from the medical kit that was always within reach, and applied pressure. "You're going to be fine. This is just a scratch," he lied, his voice a steady monotone that he hoped would be more convincing to Kelly than it was to himself. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the battle raging around him. He saw the team leader, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, motioning for him to stay down, to stay safe. But Marcus's eyes were already sweeping the kill zone. He saw the Afghan commando leader, Ahmad, lying face down in the dirt 20 meters away, not moving. In the lead vehicle, he could hear more screams. The medic in him, the part that had sworn an oath to preserve life, could not stay behind the engine block. The warrior in him knew that every man out there was a brother. The two identities, often at odds, were now in perfect, terrifying alignment. He had to move. He turned to Kelly, placing the younger man's hand on the pressure bandage. "Keep pressure here. Do not let up. I'll be back." The look in Kelly's eyes was one of pure terror, not for himself, but for Marcus. "Doc, don't. It's too hot." But Marcus was already gone. He burst from behind the Humvee, a lone figure in the open, sprinting towards the prostrate form of Commander Ahmad. The insurgent fire seemed to concentrate on him, a maelstrom of lead that chewed up the ground at his feet and sparked off the rocks around him. He didn't think. He just moved, a lifetime of training and pure adrenaline propelling him forward. He reached Ahmad, grabbed him by the collar of his uniform, and dragged him back towards the vehicle, his own body positioned between the wounded man and the relentless hail of enemy fire. He felt the snap of rounds passing through the fabric of his sleeves, the wind of a bullet that creased the side of his neck. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He just kept pulling until they were both huddled behind the relative safety of the Humvee's thick metal frame. Breathing in ragged gasps, he rolled Ahmad over. The man was alive, but badly hit, and blood seeping from wounds in his chest and leg. Marcus went to work, his hands flying through the triage process. As he worked, stabilizing the Afghan commander, a sudden terrible quiet fell over their immediate position. He looked up. The world seemed to slow down. He saw Lieutenant Hayes staring not at the enemy, but at him. The look on Hayes's face wasn't one of gratitude for saving a local ally. It was a look of stunned, bewildered recognition. It was a look that said, "I know you, but I don't know this person I'm seeing." In that frozen moment, under the blazing sun and the constant crack of distant gunfire, Marcus knew. The controlled, precise movements, the utter fearlessness in the face of certain death, the way he had moved across that open ground, not like a SEAL medic, but like a predator. It was a skill set that went beyond even the most advanced military training. It was a language spoken only by those who had done this before, many times before, in a different time and a different place. Hayes's eyes weren't just looking at a medic saving his team. They were looking at a ghost from a war that had ended before some of these young SEALs were even born. The room, or in this case, the chaotic, smoke-filled canyon, fell silent for Marcus, not audibly, but in his soul. The secret he had carried for so long, the past he had buried under layers of discipline and a new identity, was written in every move he made. The silence was deafening. Hours later, after the medevac birds had come and gone, after the sun had dipped below the jagged peaks and the firefight had dwindled to sporadic, harassing fire, Marcus sat apart from the rest of the platoon. They had established a temporary patrol base, a rocky, defensible position where the men could collapse, eat a cold MRE, and try to process the day's events. The air was cold now, a sharp contrast to the heat of the battle. Marcus could hear the murmur of voices, the dark humor that was the Special Operations soldiers' only defense against the horrors they witnessed. But no one approached him. A bubble of silence had formed around him, a direct result of the look Lieutenant Hayes had given him earlier. He sat with his back against a boulder, his med kit open beside him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was staring at his hands. They were steady now, the adrenaline long since metabolized, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. These hands had saved lives today. They had packed wounds, might applied tourniquets, and pulled men from the jaws of death. But his mind was not on today. It was on another time, another place, where these same hands had done the same things, but in a jungle so thick the sun barely pierced the canopy, where the enemy was invisible until the last second, and where the screams were in a different language. He was so lost in the past that he didn't hear the soft crunch of boots on gravel until Lieutenant Hayes was standing right in front of him. Hayes held 2 metal canteen cups, steam rising from them into the cold air. He didn't ask permission. He just sat down on a rock next to Marcus, the silence between them heavy and thick. He offered one of the cups to Marcus. Coffee. Marcus took it, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. And they sat like that for a long time, 2 men bound by the day's violence, watching the stars appear in the vast Afghan sky. Hayes didn't look at him when he finally spoke. His voice was low, thoughtful, meant only for Marcus. "I saw a lot of crazy things today, Reyes," Hayes began, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I saw Kelly take shrapnel and keep his head. I saw Simpson lay down a base of fire that would make a battalion commander proud. But I ain't never seen anything like what you did." He took a slow sip of his coffee. The way you moved across that kill zone, it wasn't just training. It was instinct. Pure old, bloody instinct. The kind of instinct you don't get from a textbook or a training exercise at Coronado. Marcus said nothing. He just stared into his cup, the dark liquid reflecting the faint starlight. He could feel Hayes's gaze on him now, a physical weight. "I've been doing this for almost 15 years, Hayes continued. "I've served with some of the baddest men on the planet, and in all that time I've only seen a handful of guys move like that. Guys who treated bullets like they were just raindrops. And every single one of them—" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Every single one of them had already died and come back once before." The silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. Marcus could feel his heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm in his chest. The walls he had so carefully constructed, the walls that had held for over 30 years, were starting to crack. Hayes wasn't asking a question, not yet. He was stating an observation, a fact that he had pieced together from the evidence of his own eyes. Finally, Hayes turned to look at him directly. In the dim light, his eyes weren't accusatory or demanding. They were curious, and there was something else there, something Marcus hadn't expected: respect. "Who were you, Reyes?" Hayes asked softly, the question not about his rank or his service record, but about the soul of the man sitting next to him. "Before the teams, before all of this, who were you?" Marcus felt the question like a physical blow. It was the question he had asked himself 1,000 times in the quiet hours of the night, the question he had never been able to answer honestly, not to his superiors, not to his friends, and not even to himself. He opened his mouth to give the standard reply, the carefully crafted cover story about growing up in New Mexico and joining the Marines right out of high school. But the words wouldn't come. The lie felt like ash on his tongue. He looked at Hayes, at the man who had trusted him with the lives of his team, and the weight of that trust, combined with the day's traumatic events, finally broke something loose inside him. He took a long, slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs. "Before the teams," he began, his voice a low rasp. "I was a corpsman in Vietnam." The words felt strange, foreign, as if someone else were speaking them. He hadn't said that out loud in decades. "I was with a SEAL team there too, back when it was all new, all just a wild experiment." He paused, the memories flooding back with a vivid, painful clarity. "We operated in the Rungsat Special Zone, the Mekong Delta, places that would swallow you whole." He looked at Hayes, searching for judgment, for disbelief. And he found neither. Hayes just nodded, a silent acknowledgement for him to continue. And so, for the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to talk. He didn't give Hayes the sanitized, heroic version. He gave him the truth. He told him about the young medic he had been, a kid who had lied about his age to get into the Navy, who had volunteered for the newly formed SEAL teams because he wanted to be where the action was. He told him about the ambushes in the jungle, so different from the wide-open spaces of Afghanistan. Ambushes that happened in a world of shadows and mud, where you often didn't see the enemy until you felt the burn of a bullet. He told him about the friends he had lost. He spoke their names like prayers. Tommy, who was taken by a sniper's bullet while crossing a stream. Dirty Dave, who stepped on a punji steak and died from infection days later, his body shutting down despite everything Marcus tried. And most of all, he told him about Lieutenant Frank DeLuca, the patrol leader who had pulled him from a muddy rice paddy after he'd been shot, saving his life, only to die in Marcus's arms an hour later from a wound to the chest. "I held him," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "I held him, and I watched the light go out of his eyes. I was a medic. I was supposed to save him, and I couldn't. I couldn't save any of them." The confession poured out of him, a torrent of grief and guilt that had been dammed up for over 30 years. He told Hayes about coming home from Vietnam, not to a hero's welcome, but to a country that wanted to forget the war and the men who had fought it. He told him about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the inability to connect with anyone. He told him about the marriages that failed, the jobs he couldn't hold, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. He told him about the decision to bury it all, to reinvent himself. He left New Mexico, let his hair grow out, changed his mannerisms. He enlisted in the Marines under his new identity, using the skills he already had to excel, and then finagled a transfer to the Navy, letting everyone assume his skills were just natural talent. He had built a new life on the ashes of the old one, hoping that if he ran far enough and fast enough, the past would never catch up. When he finally stopped talking, his voice was hoarse and his eyes were wet, though he hadn't let the tears fall. The confession had left him feeling raw, exposed, like his skin had been peeled back. He braced himself for the consequences, for Hayes to see him as a liar, a fraud, a broken relic who had no place in the modern teams. But Hayes just sat there, silent for a long moment, processing the incredible story. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion Marcus couldn't immediately identify. "You know," Hayes said quietly, "we had a corpsman in Vietnam, an uncle of mine. He never talked about it either. Drank himself to death 20 years ago." He turned and looked at Marcus, his gaze clear and steady. He was a hero. He just didn't know it. Just like you don't know it. He stood up, the conversation clearly over for now. He looked down at Marcus, the medic who had saved his men, who was a living bridge between two generations of war. "Get some rest, Doc," he said, using the nickname with a new, profound respect. "We got a long walk out of these mountains tomorrow, and I want you to know, whatever happened in that jungle, it doesn't matter to me. All I see is the man who was willing to die for my team today. That's the man I'll follow anywhere." He walked away, leaving Marcus alone with the stars and the slowly ebbing tide of his confession. For the first time in 30 years, the silence inside him wasn't filled with the ghosts of the past. It was just quiet. And for a man who had been at war with himself for so long, that quiet felt, for the first time, like it might just be the beginning of peace. The weeks following the ambush in the Paktika province were a strange, unsettling purgatory for Marcus. The platoon had extracted from the mountains and returned to their forward operating base, a sprawling collection of tents and hardened structures that hummed with the constant drone of generators and the clatter of helicopter rotors. Life, in its own bizarre way, returned to a routine of patrols, briefings, and the mind-numbing boredom that filled the hours between moments of sheer terror. But for Marcus, the routine was a lie. Everything had changed. Lieutenant Hayes had kept his word. He hadn't said a word to anyone else about Marcus's confession. He treated Marcus with the same gruff professionalism as always. But there was a new understanding in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the burden the medic carried. The rest of the platoon, however, still looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion. The story of his actions in the ambush had spread like wildfire. They all knew he had done something extraordinary, like something that bordered on the superhuman. They didn't know why, but they now watched him with a quiet reverence usually reserved for the most seasoned veterans. Marcus, however, felt like a fraud. The confession to Hayes had opened a door he had kept firmly locked for decades, and now the memories were seeping through the cracks, a slow, corrosive leak that threatened to flood his carefully constructed world. It started with the dreams. They weren't the sharp, vivid nightmares he had experienced right after Vietnam. Those had faded over the years into a dull, background hum of anxiety. These were different. These were quiet, insidious replays of moments he thought he had forgotten. The smell of the Mekong Delta at dawn, rotting vegetation, diesel fumes, and gunpowder. or the sound of a single cricket chirping in the oppressive silence before an ambush. The weight of Lieutenant DeLuca's head in his lap as the life drained from his body. He would wake up in his cot in the middle of the night, drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could feel the humidity of the jungle on his skin, hear the distant crump of artillery. He would lie there in the darkness, staring at the canvas roof of the tent, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to remember where he was. Afghanistan, 2003, not Vietnam, 1968. He would repeat the facts like a mantra, trying to anchor himself in the present. But the past was no longer content to stay buried. During the day, the triggers were everywhere, or the dull thud of a distant explosion would send him diving for cover before his conscious mind even registered the sound. The sight of a local villager in a conical hat, a common sight in the region, would freeze him in his tracks, his mind superimposing the face of a Viet Cong guerrilla onto the harmless farmer. He became hyper-vigilant, his senses on high alert even within the relative safety of the base. He would find himself scanning rooftops and windows during simple walks to the mess hall, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He tried to control it, to push it all back down into the box where it belonged. He told himself it was just the stress of the deployment, the adrenaline of the ambush finally wearing off. He increased his PT, running until his legs burned and his lungs screamed, and trying to exhaust his body into silence. He volunteered for every patrol, hoping that the focus on the current danger would drown out the echoes of the past. But nothing worked. The ghosts were patient, and they had waited a long time for their chance to speak. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon, 3 weeks after the ambush. The platoon was tasked with a presence patrol through a small village near the base. It was a routine mission meant to show the flag and gather intelligence. As they moved through the narrow, dusty streets, children ran out to greet them, their laughter a stark contrast to the ever-present tension. Marcus walked in the middle of the formation, his eyes scanning, his M4 held at the ready. They passed a small compound with an open courtyard. Inside, an old woman sat on a worn mat, weaving a basket. She looked up as they passed, her face a road map of deep wrinkles, her eyes dark and unreadable. She wore loose black clothing, and a conical hat lay on the ground beside her. For a split second, the world tilted on its axis. The dust of Afghanistan became the mud of the Delta. The flat, tan buildings became the lush, green hooches of a Vietnamese village. And the old woman's face. Her face was the face of the old woman who had watched him from a doorway 30 years ago. The one who had smiled as his point man stepped on a booby trap that blew his leg off. Time stopped. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the street, his eyes locked on the woman. He could hear the explosion, could hear the screams, could see the blood. He could feel the helpless rage, the overwhelming guilt. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and his finger tightened on the trigger guard. He was no longer in Afghanistan. He was back. He was home in the only home the war had ever given him. "Reyes! Marcus! Hey, Doc, you with us?" The voice was distant at first, muffled, as if coming from underwater. Then it grew sharper, more insistent. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, hard. He spun, his weapon coming up, his eyes wild and unfocused. He found himself staring into the concerned face of Simpson, one of the younger SEALs on the team. Simpson's hands were up, palms out, a look of genuine fear on his face. "Whoa, Doc. Easy, man. It's me. It's Simpson. You were 1,000,000 miles away." Marcus blinked, the image of the Vietnamese village slowly dissolving, replaced by the harsh Afghan reality. The old woman was still there, still watching him, but now she just looked like a confused, elderly villager. He lowered his weapon, his arms trembling with the effort. He could feel the eyes of the entire platoon on him. He had just lost it. In front of everyone, the perfect operator, The man who moved through bullets like a ghost had just had a complete breakdown in the middle of a simple patrol. Hayes materialized at his side. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Marcus, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at the platoon and gave a sharp hand signal to keep moving. He fell into step beside Marcus, his presence a silent, steady anchor. The rest of the patrol was a blur. Marcus moved on autopilot, his mind a churning mess of shame, fear, and confusion. The walls were down, the past was out, and everyone had seen it. When they finally returned to the FOB, Hayes pulled him aside, leading him to a quiet corner away from the noise of the base. "Sit down, Reyes," Hayes said, his voice tired but firm. Marcus sat on an ammo crate, his head in his hands. He couldn't look at Hayes. He couldn't face the disappointment, the judgment he was sure to see. "I'm sorry, sir," Marcus mumbled. "I don't know what happened. It won't happen again. I can still do my job." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I know you can do your job, Marcus. That's not the question." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened out there? That wasn't a lack of focus. That was something else. I've seen it before. In guys who've seen too much." He knelt down, bringing himself to Marcus's eye level. "That box you put everything in, the one you told me about? It's broken, Marcus. It's been broken for a long time. And you've just been holding it together with duct tape and willpower. You can't do that forever. It will kill you, or worse, it will get one of these men killed." Marcus looked up, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate pain. "What am I supposed to do? I can't tell anyone? They'll take my trident? They'll kick me out? This is all I have? This is all I am?" Hayes shook his head slowly. "That's the old way of thinking, Marcus. That's the Vietnam way. It's why your generation came home and fell apart. It's why my uncle drank himself to death. We're not doing that anymore. We can't afford to." He looked Marcus straight in the eye. "You're not going to lose your trident. You're a goddamn hero. But you need help. Real help. Not just PT and more patrols. You need to talk to someone who understands this. A doc, a chaplain, a someone." "The teams will find out," Marcus protested weakly, the last vestiges of his defense crumbling. "The teams already know, Marcus," Hayes said gently. "They saw it today, and they're not judging you. They're scared for you. You're their medic. They need you sharp. They need you whole." He stood up. "I'm not giving you an order, Marcus. I'm asking you as your friend. Let me help you. Let us help you. You've been carrying this alone for 30 years. It's time to put it down." Marcus stared at the ground, the weight of Hayes's words pressing down on him. He thought about the old woman's face, the sound of the explosion, the feel of Lieutenant DeLuca's blood on his hands. He thought about 30 years of running, 30 years of hiding, 30 years of being a ghost in his own life. He was so tired, so impossibly tired. And he looked up at Hayes, and for the first time, the mask was completely gone. He was just a man, a broken, exhausted man who had finally reached the end of his rope. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Hayes returned the nod, his expression one of profound relief. He didn't say another word. He just reached down, put a hand on Marcus's shoulder, and gave it a firm, reassuring squeeze. In that simple gesture, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in decades. He felt not alone. The decision to accept help was the hardest thing Marcus Reyes had ever done, harder than any combat mission, harder than dragging wounded men through kill zones, harder even than burying his friends. It felt like an admission of ultimate failure, a public declaration that he was weak, broken, unfit. And the days following his breakdown in the village were a haze of shame and anxiety. He avoided eye contact with the rest of the platoon, convinced they were all whispering about him, their respect for him shattered.